I'd like, first of all, to make certain that I'm reasonably in conjunction with this public address system. I hope you'll let me know if I get too close or too far back. And first of all, I should apologize to all of you and assure you that you needn't feel uncomfortable if my voice begins to disappear during the evening. I spent most of last week with some kind of upper respiratory virus, and my vocal cords are still a little bit uncertain. And I know it's awkward for an audience to sit and listen to somebody who's coughing and drinking water and trying to feel his way through. Let me be embarrassed, and you needn't worry. When Mr. Berwick first asked me to share in this series, when he first asked me some weeks ago with a talk on leisure and reading, I balked at once, for I saw this as but one more task that would nibble away at such few odd moments as I can still find myself for leisurely reading. Yet I could hardly decline, for certainly to consider broadly the uses of leisure in a series of this kind and an audience of this persistence, without considerable reference to books and to reading, would only compound the crass and mindless definition of old age, retirement, and leisure that is, I fear, behind much of the discussion of these matters, especially, I think, in the real estate sections of the local press. Such discussions would appear to define retirement and leisure in our society solely in terms of an endless playtime at a sun-drenched resort, completely isolated from the intellectual, social, and economic cares of society, and too often, I think, isolated also from society's cultural centers. Discussions of this kind would appear to deny, or at least to forget, I fear, that leisure for the young and for the old should imply also the opportunity and even the responsibility for intensified self-education, heightened self-knowledge, even reflection, and hopefully the pursuit of wisdom. There is, I think, too much lamenting these days that our times lack respect for old age, whereas in fact our society does, I'm convinced, respect old age that is at once wise, creative, and socially responsible. We do respect deeply the Baruchs, the Harrimans, the Schweitzers, and the Lipschitzes. Well, I fear this is a heavy-handed and moralizing way to introduce what I hoped might be an appealing topic. Let me add, as Mr. Berwick indicated, that I was led to accept this assignment also by the very nice coincidence that this is National Library Week, those few days out of the year when we're all expected to read more books instead of concentrating on wearing more cotton or eating more peanuts. Actually, the topic I'm to discuss this evening was introduced to the university and regional community about 2 weeks ago during the university's conference on the cultural arts, which some of this group may have attended. On the opening evening in Royce Hall, when President Kennedy's advisor on the cultural arts, Mr. August Heckscher, talked. Those of you who were there will recall, at least I noticed very pleasantly, that he particularly called for a return to the art of reading as being one of the few arts in our crowded metropolitan centers that the average individual could find space to indulge in. And finally, I undertook this assignment because it seems to me that the time is uncommonly ripe for an optimistic public discussion of libraries and of reading. And let me at this point forewarn some of my friends in the audience that this is not intended to be a conversation with the university audience but a conversation with the community, with the public community. I think this is an optimistic time, because as recently as 5 years ago, on quite another hand, one might have felt some grim pessimism in the face of this very topic. At that time, Rudolph Flesch's cranky book, Why Johnny Can't Read, was a noisy bestseller, and the Gallup polls were hard put to find any adult American who had voluntarily read a book from preface to index during the previous year. It looked then as though American society were reverting to slack illiteracy at a time when entire new societies in Africa and South Asia were quick with the excitement of new literacy and a hunger for books. Yet today, so very few years later, the libraries of this country are swarming with eager young readers, whom the libraries, unhappily, are ill-prepared to serve. At this time, the scientific community is clamoring for the kind of help that only an intensified and retooled librarianship can provide. And finally, the President of the United States is calling for greater fiscal support for libraries of all kinds. If only then American society today can rise to the occasion quickly and with public responsibility, the Gallup polls of the next generation may reveal a quite different state of reading. Now, in this same series, a week ago when Dean Abbott Kaplan talked, those of you who were here will remember that he mentioned particularly the general increase in circulation of books in public libraries, the increase in the public sale of books. So in a sense, he introduced what I want to say, but I'm going to concentrate on one particular aspect of this audience, the reading audience. It seems to me, and to many of my colleagues, that one of the striking and optimistic social phenomena of the last 2 to 3 years is represented by the surging throngs of young people that are actually overwhelming our public libraries with such business as librarians have not seen since the Great Depression, those cruel years when leisure was involuntary rather than voluntary. This development today is so sudden, so unexpected, and so obvious that even the green sheet of San Fernando, the Valley News, recently carried banner headlines and an extensive story on the student flood that swamps the libraries. Yet this is by no means a local phenomenon. Librarians from New Jersey to West Los Angeles are concerned with the insistent and the curious demands of high school students who come regularly in such numbers as to preempt all available seats, wear out all available books, and leave the librarians themselves distressed that library resources are quite inadequate to this eager and youthful need. For delighted as they are, or at least should be, by this vigorous demonstration of literacy and intellectual curiosity, librarians are also startled and unprepared to deal with it adequately. Next summer, the American Library Association will alter the entire pattern of its annual conference in order to concentrate specifically on young students and libraries. The president of the association states the case in this way. Students of all levels, their appetites whetted by a much sharpened educational program, and with their normal intellectual curiosity stimulated by new interests in the modern world, are now making demands for library service that can scarcely be met at all, and certainly not meant with any sense of adequacy from the viewpoint of qualitative or of quantitative standards. In some way and somehow, we in this country have underestimated the importance of libraries in the educational process. And we've done this at a time of great need for high-quality library service. We now find that our libraries have insufficient staff, insufficient books, and inadequate budgets to provide them. You may have noticed in the press recently some discussions in the city between the city library officials and people in the Board of Education, which indicated what would seem to me a shocking situation in this great metropolitan center, which provides 64 cents per pupil for books in the elementary schools, as compared with a national average more than twice as large. A great metropolitan center that provides the exciting quantity of 1.93 books per student, as compared with a national average 3 and 4 times larger. And today in California, which once had an internationally respected, pioneering public library service, the number of books per capita in public libraries throughout the state has been declining steadily since 1941. We are, in fact, back to the 1921 level. In this regard, with the magnanimous provision in California of 1.3 books per person in public libraries. Not much chance for browsing among 1.3 books, I would guess. Now, in addition to this quantitative pressure for books in libraries, there's another kind of pressure. It's obvious also in a greater complexity and a greater sophistication of demand. High school students today, unlike those of as recently as a decade or more ago, are seeking highly specialized magazines, advanced reference books, government reports, materials that the local branch public library seldom stocks except in short supply. This qualitative change is made evident at UCLA by the numbers, the hordes of eager high school students who flock to the university library from all of the Los Angeles area on weekends, in the evenings, and particularly during the Christmas and the Easter recess period. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was a rare school youngster who had the need or the courage or the ability to make use of our fairly complicated institution. But today, university students complain to me about the amount of competition of high school students seeking books and seats in the university's libraries. A tremendous change in attitude and in interest. A comparable upgrading is noticeable also within the university student community. The circulation of books here at the UCLA Library has mounted recently at over 20% per year, a far greater rate than the increase in the numbers of users. So we can only grossly assume that the individual user today requires more books than was the case 5 and 10 years ago. Last year, the university library, for example, loaned out 1,944,000 books, a fair turnover since we don't quite own that many. But this evening, those of you who are used to this series may well ask what this recent development has to do with the uses of leisure, which is what we've been discussing the last several weeks. After all, these diligent young people, admirable as their pursuit of learning may be, are engaged in assigned and businesslike reading rather than in leisurely reading. And to this reasonable question, I would say that the connection is vital and that it's manifold. In the first instance, reading, like any complex skill, requires application and it requires practice. The pleasures in reading, as in any complex skill, increase with competence and with versatility. The private quest that is laid open through books is the more appealing and the more rewarding as one reads with increased skill and with increased frequency. Thus, I would judge that these modern youngsters will continue to read for profit and for pleasure, at work and at leisure, to a degree that was unknown in my generation. It appears to me that Johnny can read, after all, and that he will read when society puts a positive value on reading. Part of Johnny's problem has been in the goals and the example set for him by his elders, whom he seldom, I'm sure, caught in the barefaced act of reading anything more than the newspaper or Life magazine. As George Saintsbury is said to have replied when asked how to interest the young in good literature, just leave books around. But now that young people are frequenting libraries and buying paperbacks, it is up to us, the senior ones, to support the momentum. If we today encourage this new excitement, and if we support it with, for example, improved public library service in our communities, we can perhaps open up for our children a richer intellectual life than we enjoyed, and thereupon their leisure, which will probably be ampler than ours, may become also more rewarding than ours. Secondly, I think this heightened interest in the studious use of books is relevant to this series of conversations on leisure because it does, in fact, focus our attention on the public library, and it reveals then a shocking public neglect of that library in recent years. And this, in turn, I say, is relevant to our conversations because the public library, that is the tax-supported library, freely available to all classes and ages of society, and providing access without restraint to the whole spectrum of ideas and information. This public library, which we often forget, is a very remarkable and yet often undervalued social institution. And moreover, in its inception, it is a peculiarly Anglo-American institution of which we, I think, can be especially proud. And furthermore, it is a public institution that arose a century ago, particularly to serve the needs of the ambitious individual who proposed on his own initiative to put his newfound leisure to effective use. Just over 100 years ago, in 1828, the Reverend Abel Abbott, pastor of the Unitarian Church of Peterborough, New Hampshire, proposed that, in formal 18th century style, the desire of knowledge is ardent in the youthful mind, curiosity is awake, and there are leisure hours. There are leisure hours which may be profitably improved. Books suitable for the young will afford them a rich entertainment, keep them from idleness, improve their minds and their manners. One family, he said, cannot well furnish the number and variety of books desirable, but many families, at small expense each, can be well supplied. Now, the Reverend Abbott was one of the very first proponents in this country, or in any country, of the library as a factor in public education in these terms, hardly second in importance to the public school. He was one of the first to see it as a community enterprise, supported by the community for all members of the community. Just 5 years later, in 1833, the town meeting of Peterborough established what is thought to be the first public library in this country. And you will note that its directors stated as its function that those who have left the common schools have the means of continuing their education, and all who have leisure have the advantages of improvement. Thus, in its very inception, the public library has been devoted to the interests of what we're discussing in this series, the uses of leisure. It arose then, as we know it today, about the middle of the last century. Prior to then, of course, there had been libraries both here and abroad, but the earlier forms of libraries had failed to fulfill a widespread and a very urgent social need. There were scholarly libraries for the learned. There were commercial subscription libraries for those who could afford to pay the fees. There were mercantile libraries established to improve the minds of young clerks, and Mechanics' Institute libraries for the self-improvement of young artisans. But these also were supported by direct fees. It's interesting to note that in San Francisco we still have a Mechanics' Institute library, an interesting relic of the Industrial Revolution. In Great Britain, moreover, more so I think than in this country, various church groups in the late 18th and early 19th centuries developed organized programs to put books into the hands of what were called then the lower classes, but those efforts were suspect as being gratuitous and as being very patronizing. Well, this in brief was the library background to a period of tremendous social unrest and change, both in the United States and in Great Britain. It was the late 18th and the early 19th centuries that saw the rise of public education and of the organized working class, movements reflecting two deep-seated beliefs. First of all, the inherent right and ability of the individual to improve himself and thus to improve his lot in society. And secondly, the importance of a universal literacy to the maintenance of a democratic society and a common culture. It was these two fundamental beliefs, then, among others, that led to the concept of a universal, a public, a tax-supported library service. The public library grew up concurrently with the public school and with the trade union as a fundamental institution in a new democratic society. Horace Mann, the great American educational reformer, declared about this time, "Had I the power, I would scatter libraries over the land as the sower sows his wheat field." Now it was left, of course, to a Scot emigrated to this country, a Scot who knew something himself at first hand about self-improvement and about the Industrial Revolution, Andrew Carnegie, to pick up Horace Mann's simile at a much later date and literally to sow libraries over the land. Now, what the public library accomplished as a community service was to put books within the reach of every individual, theoretically, and to make the selection of those books a general, a public responsibility, rather than a special interest or a patronizing responsibility. The public library allowed the individual, on his own initiative, at his own pace, to pursue his private quest wherever it might lead him. Here, I think, is the unique and the essential function of the public library in our society. Its efforts are focused on the needs and on the rights of the individual to pursue his own destiny. And this I take to be a noble function in our kind of culture, a culture which is based on the integrity and the perfectibility of the individual. No other social institution, I think, is so effectively dedicated to individual aspirations, with all of the flexibility and all of the variety that such a mission implies. Now that is why, ladies and gentlemen, that the librarians in your communities cease to be shy and retiring and turn into flaming missionaries when the misguided special interest censor demands the removal of Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ, or any other particular book from the local library. The public library was established a century ago specifically to assure, in a democratic society, that the individual could read what he wanted to read and not what some special group thought he should read. The eminent English Cambridge professor Raymond Williams, who's done much to illuminate the reading of 19th century England, has put the case similarly for Great Britain. The public library movement in this country, England he's speaking of, was born out of a group of new readers demanding more than the right to read, demanding the right to read what they wanted to read. These new readers had had quite enough of being told what was good for them to read. Now this is why, ladies and gentlemen, you should support your librarian in such a crisis, for he is defending not so much a particular book, but a fundamental democratic concept. Man's private quest for enlightenment, for encouragement, for truth will lead him along a multitude of paths, and the librarian's task is to keep all the paths open and assure that none are fenced off. Now, all that I have said, about the increasing use of libraries by young students these days and about the functions of a public library suggest also, I hope, why the public library needs and deserves your full public support. The library is dedicated essentially to the best uses of leisure, and it serves them well. Thus, as our society rapidly increases the amount of leisure available to all of us, we as citizens must assure that the public library receives adequate community support, both moral support and fiscal support. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Depression years multiplied remarkably the use of libraries by adults who poured in to put their unexpected leisure to some effective use. From this experience came an intensified and a more formalized adult education movement centering in large metropolitan public libraries. But in more prosperous times, we began to take the library for granted, to accept it as a kind of monument in town, but to forget it on the tax rolls. That is why this year the California legislature is giving serious attention to Assembly Bill 590, which would provide matching state funds in support of California's hard-pressed public libraries, a bill which has just recently passed through the Assembly. This is why President Kennedy's recent message on education gave top billing and frequent mention to the need for greater library support. The first time, many of us think, that libraries have received direct presidential mention in a budget message. All that is required now is a grassroots understanding, grassroots support, for the public library is indeed a local institution. I think that as members of the American community, we can also take great pride in the extension of this concept of the public library to other parts of the world in recent times. I had the exciting pleasure about 3 years ago of attending the dedication in a working class district in the city of Rome of a new library established by the United States Information Service as a kind of demonstration of what free access to books can mean in a city in which prior to that time there had been nothing like free access to books. The excitement, the enthusiasm, the curiosity was thrilling, I would think, not just to a librarian, but to anybody concerned with the whole problem of literacy. A few years earlier, I think I was even more excited to visit in Mexico City the comparable United States Information Service Library, the Biblioteca Benjamin Franklin, one of the first efforts on the part of our State Department to suggest to people abroad what a public library service can mean. And I was there mid-afternoon when the school children arrived at the only institution in Mexico City where students could freely borrow books. It was a mob scene, full of excitement, full of enthusiasm, full of meaning, I think, for all of us as we consider what public libraries can mean. Now, in its focus on the individual, the library is, of course, but an extension of and a multiplication of the book. For as the writer Marchette Chute has said, of all the arts of communication, the book is the one that goes straight for the individual. It is not tailored to a group audience. It is not the product of many minds speaking to many minds. It is the single individual speaking to the single individual, and in a voice that does not need to be raised because it is not shouting for attention. Or as Harold Taylor, the stimulating former president of Sarah Lawrence College, has put it, the book is a personal communication in an impersonal world. One doesn't, I think, need to make any kind of snide judgment in comparing books with other media of communication, but it is important for our purposes this evening, I think, to observe that the book is the one private medium of communication in a mass society. It is the one medium designed for solitude and for reflection, and the one medium that fully respects individual difference. And this, I take, this respect for individual difference, is a precious commodity in American society, and particularly today. We might profitably pursue this line of thought a bit further in a lecture series concerned with leisure, especially but not solely concerned with the leisure that comes with retirement. Most of the discussions I come across on this subject are concerned with a kind of frantic search for group activity for retired people, as though gregariousness were the only safe manner of leisure life, and as though solitude and privacy were per se rather frightful concepts. As a matter of fact, aloneness, which need not be equated with loneliness, is an essential fact of human life, as we all know. As Richard Eberhart, the American poet, has said, "It is borne in upon me that pain is essential. The bones refuse to act. Recalcitrancy is life's fine flower. The human being is a lonely creature." And similarly, William Carlos Williams, the obstetrician turned poet who died but recently, said this: "I am lonely, lonely. I was born to be lonely. I am best so. Who shall say I am not the happy genius of my household?" Moreover, in these days of retirement, retirement and old age may, to be sure, increase one's aloneness. Let it be said simply, then, that reading, if pursued creatively as a private quest, can make solitude flower rather than pall. David Reisman, the well-known critic of The Lonely Crowd, has put it very pungently, I think, in saying that the cubicle is as characteristic of the library as isolation is uncharacteristic of the modern moving picture theater. The library and the book offer, I think, the best haven for the lonely traveler. And once one has reached that haven, there are other advantages. Dean Francis Chase of the University of Chicago wrote recently, "Escape from anxiety can be sought either through non-thought or through the kind of reflective thought that brings new understandings and hence new power. Non-thought takes one into a fantasy world and lulls the critical senses, whereas reflective thought merges the ephemeral present and its apparently insoluble problems with a wider perspective of human struggle, human achievement, and human tragedy. Reflective thought," he said, "seems to me more likely to occur when one is reading than in most other contexts in the modern world." Now let me underscore this rather abstract statement by Dean Chase by using, it seems to me, a very pertinent witness, the Right Honorable Earl Attlee, the former British Prime Minister. In a speech I had the pleasure of hearing him make a few years ago, many years after his retirement from a very busy and a very badgered life. This is what he had to say. "And so one is never alone if one has been a reader. In vital affairs, too, it is always well to be able to look back to the past. I remember," said Earl Attlee, "those grim days of 1940, when England was having it so bad. I remember those grim days of 1940 when we had our backs to the wall. How one day everything was looking extremely black, and I thought I needed some kind of refreshment. I did not go," he said, "into the local," by which he meant the local pub, the local saloon. "I did not go into the local. I went into the library. And there I reread a great speech of Pericles on the dead at Marathon. I came away revived. One has history in one's mind, and one reads back and recalls that, after all, other people have been in the same difficult position as we have. And one recalls that just as Athens stood against the barbarians of Persia, so we were then standing for civilization against the Nazis. I find," said Earl Attlee, "as I grow older, that perhaps I read more and more." Now let me add to this, which I think is a striking example of this generalization about what reading can mean. Let me add some other declarations from some poets who often, I suggest, know more about the subtleties of the human spirit than do most of the learned psychiatrists, and they probably cost less too. I feel some hesitation reading poetry here this evening, having heard an eminent reader of poetry from this same podium earlier today. First of all, Mr. Randall Jarrell one-time poetry consultant to the Library of Congress. 4 short lines, but very apt, I think. The soul learns fortitude in libraries, enduring patience in another's pain, and pity for the lives we do not change, and that the world would be if it were real. The soul learns fortitude in libraries. Now listen to another contemporary poet, Richard Eberhart, say the same thing in other terms. Then in the buckle of tragedy, in multifarious instances, may not a furtive mark on paper speak for the dignity of man. He's saying, I think, the same thing that Randall Jarrell said. I mentioned earlier the physician poet William Carlos Williams. He says the same thing. Books will give rest sometimes against the uproar of water falling and writing itself to refall, filling the mind with its reverberation, shaking stone. Books will give rest sometimes against the uproar. But for most of us, fortunately, life is not solely a matter of adjustment to pain and to tragedy. Unfortunately, also, the infinitely varied world of books can provide enrichment and extension under any circumstances, if we only have the imagination to seek it out. Kenneth Rexroth, the San Francisco poet and critic, who spoke here recently at the university's Cultural Arts Conference, some of you may have heard him in Rice Hall, had these pertinent words to say in one of his early poems called aptly, The Further Advantages of Learning. One day in the library, puzzled and distracted, leafing through a dull book, I came on a picture of the vase containing Buddha's relics. A chill passed over me. I was haunted by the touch of a calm I cannot know, the opening into that busy place of a better world. Somewhat similarly, another poet critic, R.P. Blackmore, recalls, using a phrase that I think is particularly charming and pertinent, the comfortable noise long reading makes, brimming within the inner ear. This, I think, beautifully illustrates the whole significance of reading and more reading. The comfortable noise long reading makes, brimming within the inner ear. No one, I think, has more pungently stated the incomparable place of books in continuous self-education and learning than the Welsh lyric poet Dylan Thomas, who died so tragically and young, as seems to be the lot of his kind. Possibly some of you had the pleasure that I did of hearing him read from this stage some 12 or so years ago. I see some nodding in the audience. What Dylan Thomas said was this: my education was the liberty I had to read indiscriminately and all the time with my eyes hanging out. Now let me come to a conclusion by reading just a bit more from some wise and perceptive and even light-hearted poets as they comment on books and reading. I mentioned earlier Randall Jarrell. Here's a bit from his charming poem called A Girl in a Library. Assignments, recipes, the official rule book of basketball, let them go, you needn't mind. The soul has no assignments, neither cooks nor referees. It wastes its time. It wastes its time. Here in this enclave there are centuries for you to waste. The short and narrow stream of life meanders into 1,000 valleys of all that was or might have been or is to be. The books just leafed through whisper endlessly. In rooms alone, in galleries, in libraries, In tears, in searchings of the heart, in staggering joys, we memorize once more our old creation, humanity. This, I think, is the perfect picture of the library if we think of it in these sensitive terms. Here in this enclave, here in the library, there are centuries for you to waste. Leisure can go on forever in those circumstances. The books just leaf through, whisper endlessly. You'll recall the earlier comment by Mr. Blackmore, the comfortable noise long reading makes, brimming within the inner ear. Here the books just leaf through, whisper endlessly. And then again, Dr. William Carlos Williams, in one of his long poems, has this to say. A cool of books will sometimes lead the mind to libraries of a hot afternoon, if books can be found, cool to the sense to lead the mind away. For there is a wind or ghost of a wind in all books echoing the life there, a high wind that fills the tubes of the ear until we think we hear a wind actual to lead the mind away. Drawn from the streets, we break off our mind's seclusion and are taken up by the book's wind, seeking down the wind until we are unaware which is the wind and which the wind's power over us to lead the mind away. And there grows in the mind a scent, it may be, of locust blossoms, whose perfume is itself a wind moving to lead the mind away. More recently, the very young English poet, Danny Apps, says this about the public library in one of his newest books. Who in the public library one evening after rain, amongst the polished tables and linoleum, I guess I should say, who in the public library one evening after rain, amongst the polished tables and the linoleum, stands bored under blank light to glance at these pages? Whose absent mood, like neon glowing in the night, is conversant with wet pavements, nothing to do? Neutral, the clock-watching girl stamps out the date, a forced celebration, a posthumous birthday, her head buttered by the drizzling library lamps. Yet the accident of words, too, can light the semi-dark, should the reader lead them home, generously journey, later to return, perhaps leaving a bus ticket as a bookmark. And finally, to give these comments the imprimatur of the ages, and I think in recognition of the wonderful gift of books that came to us just this week, let me consider for you the paternal advice of Rabbi Judin ibn Tibban of Lunel back about the middle of the 12th century, who had this to say in another kind of poetic language. My son, make thy books thy companions. Let thy bookcase and shelves be thy pleasure grounds and gardens. Bask in their paradise, gather their fruit, pluck their roses, take their spices and myrrh. If thy soul be satiate and weary, change from garden to garden, from furrow to furrow, from prospect to prospect. Let me only hope then, ladies and gentlemen, that I have reminded you, whether young or old, that the readily accessible world of books and libraries offers infinite opportunities in moments of leisure to expand the horizons of knowledge or of imagination, to multiply one's own personal experience, which is so limited in time and space and depth by the richer experience of countless others. And the opportunity to do this at one's own pace, on one's own initiative, as a private quest, rather than as an homogenized mass absorption. Go forth then as readers, generously journey in the world of books, and ladies and gentlemen, generously support your public libraries. Thank you.